Have you ever wondered how do we organize the financial structure of a company in a way that is maintainable and also complies with legal standards? How do we deal with complex accounting systems where you have multiple accounts and these accounts can branch out into individual sub-accounts? But most importantly, how do we create a chart of accounts that is appropriate for our application and also fits the requirements of our business logic? An improper chart of accounts can create multiple problems down the road, including impacting the flexibility of the financial reporting of our entity. A well-organized chart of accounts plays a pivotal role in providing a clear breakdown of the company's assets, liabilities, capital accounts, income, and expenses. On this video, we will be talking about the fundamentals of the chart of accounts model on Django Ledger, and I will be providing practical examples to incorporate in your project. If you want to learn more about Django Ledger, make sure to get your free guide available at miguelsanda.com/getstarted. Don't forget to show your support by liking and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps in bringing more valuable content to the community. Also, for questions and or comments on Django Ledger, don't forget to join the Django Ledger Discord channel, linked in the description below. I'm Miguel Sanda, creator and lead developer of the Django Ledger project, and on this video, we're going to deep dive into the chart of accounts model, and we'll be providing practical examples to incorporate into your project. Now, let's hit it. All right, guys, so in this video, we're going to be covering the chart of accounts model. By now, you should have a fully configured development environment. If none of that makes sense, make sure to go ahead and check the video on how to set up your development environment before watching this video. Now, let's go ahead and open the chart of accounts notebook, which is within the notebooks folder of our Django Ledger starter template. And let's open the chart of accounts model. All right, the first thing we're going to see is our basic imports. Let's go ahead and click Shift-Enter to make sure that we import all of that. Now, let's define what a chart of accounts is. And a chart of accounts is really an index of accounts. It's really a list of accounts that are used to transact in the general ledger, okay? As I mentioned, it is important to have a well-organized chart of accounts to help us drive a lot of the financial reporting of our entity. All right, so the first thing that we're going to be doing is getting or creating our administrator Django UserModel. This piece of code is going to create a user of username CEO user and is going to assign a password to it. Please note that this is a temporary password, and I do not recommend any of this for production environments. All right, let's go ahead and execute that with Shift-Enter. Now we have a CEO user. Next, we're going to be creating our entity model. This piece of code is going to pull this entity if it already exists in the database. If not, it's going to create it from scratch. Now, you can see that we're calling the create entity method right here from the entity model. All right, the next thing we're going to do is to create an entity model. This piece of code right here is going to get it or create it, depending if you have executed this code before. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the name of this entity to make sure it's created from scratch. All right, and Shift-Enter. Now, notice that I am not using the entity model.objects.create function from Django, and I do not recommend using it. I do recommend using the create entity function from the entity model, just because there's a lot going on under the hood, and we have to make sure that our entities are created correctly. All right, so in order to create a chart of accounts, we need to operate on our entity model. We use the create chart of accounts function, and we're going to need a chart of accounts name, and the commit equals true means that this transaction will be committed into the database as soon as it is executed. All right, so we have created our first chart of accounts. If we want to see the list of chart of accounts for this particular entity, we can access the management UI. And I have included here a code that is going to give you the link to that view. Click here, and you see that we have created a tutorial chart of accounts for this particular. Please note that if this is the first time you accessing the management UI, you will need to log in first with your CEO user credentials we just created a moment ago. Since an entity can have multiple chart of accounts, one of them can be assigned as default, meaning that unless we explicitly say which chart of accounts we want to operate on, so in order to check that an entity has a default chart of accounts, we can use the has default COA function within the entity model. And we can see that there is no default chart of accounts for this particular entity. There is the option of assigning the chart of accounts a default at the moment of creation by passing assign as default equals true. Now we have created two different chart of accounts. We can go back to our Django Ledger management UI and click refresh, and we can see that we have two chart of accounts. The highlighted one is the one that we have assigned as default. And you can clearly see right here that it is the entity default. Now, how can we change the default chart of accounts for an entity? We could use the set default COA function of the entity model. We can see that the COA model 1 is now the default chart of accounts for this entity. And we can verify that by refreshing this view. Great, you can see that we have changed the default chart of accounts. Now we can check for a default chart of account again, and we see it is true. The default chart of accounts can be also accessed from the entity model, like so. Also, we can see that since we've assigned the COA model number 1 as default, it is the same. Default chart of accounts can also be assigned via slug or by the ID of the chart of accounts. You can see that each chart of accounts is assigned an ID, which is a string that identifies the chart of accounts in the database. Great, you can see it also works. Now, if we decide to pass in a string, please be mindful that it will be validated. Like for instance, we can pass a string that will not be assigned to any chart of account, and we're gonna have an exception being raised saying that this chart of accounts is invalid for this particular entity. All right, we can also set the default chart of accounts by passing an instance of a chart of accounts model. In this particular case, the program will make sure that the past chart of accounts instance is valid for that particular entity. We can see that this particular chart of accounts is not valid for the entity model. Let me comment that. All right, so how do we list the chart of accounts models for an entity? Okay, the first option we have is to use the Jangle relational manager, the same manager that all Django models has when they span for a relationship. All right, so now how do we list the chart of accounts models? All right, so how do we list the chart of account models associated with an entity? The first option is to use the Django relational manager, which is the same manager every Django Ledger model has to span any foreign key within the database. So we could use that. And if we use pandas, we could see that there's two chart of accounts right here, that the ones that we just created. Finally, each chart of account carries a status, active or inactive. Inactive chart of accounts will not be available to transact. And we can check that programmatically by calling the isActive method. And we can see it is true. Also, we can verify right here, both chart of accounts are active. We can programmatically mark as inactive by calling the mark as inactive. And again, commit equals true means that it will be committed into the database right away. Now, if the chart of accounts is already inactive, and we want to raise an exception if this is already the case, we can just pass raise exception equals true. And we can see that the program will raise the validation error. Once again, we can have another method called mark as active, and then we can commit that away. Another option is to manage your chart of accounts in the management UI. You could see here that we could just mark as inactive, mark as active again. We can mark as default. We could see that we cannot inactivate the default chart of accounts. This is just default behavior. All right, so what is happening under the hood? The chart of account is really a hierarchy of accounts. And I have some boilerplate code here that is going to give you a visual of what I mean. As you can see, every time we create a new chart of accounts, a basic account structure is created. This account structure is called the root node, and it's composed of 7 different nodes. There are 2 types of nodes. There is the root chart of accounts node and the root account node. If we execute the next cell, you're going to see a chart which is going to depict how the chart of accounts is structured. The root node establishes the genesis of the chart of accounts, and it is subdivided into 6 different groups. Each group will have a role within the chart of accounts financial system. And these roles line up with common standards and practices within the accounting domain. We can see that we have the asset accounts root node, the liability accounts root node, the capital accounts root node, the cost of goods sold root node. We have the income accounts root node and the expense account root node. You can also see that each one of these nodes is locked, which means that you cannot transact on any of these accounts. Any new account creating in the future will need to branch off of one of these root nodes, effectively grouping each account into each one of these individual groups. In the next video, we're going to be talking about the account model, where we're going to learn how to create new accounts that branch off of any of these root nodes. All right, guys, that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this in the future. And I'll see you in the next one. See ya.